great to be here because the topic, which I was asked to do, or broad hints, in terms of something to do with Troy, but that would, the Troy exhibition at the British Museum, which if you haven't seen yet, I really do recommend. Preferably something that very much brought it up to date with the sort of interest. But I've been really, really interested in this since certainly about 2006, because I wrote a book called The Return of Ulysses, which was published in 2008, which was about the extraordinary global penetration of the Odyssey, the other one. And the Odyssey has been translated into more languages than any book in the world except for the Christian Bible and the fables of Aesop. Okay? Interestingly enough, you can actually quantify that. The Iliad, although generally regarded both by ancient and modern critics as superior, this is the general opinion, has never or very rarely engendered such huge amounts of adaptations, novels, poems, operas, shows as the Odyssey. And you can demonstrate this quantifiably, and there are reasons to do with the personal appeal to individuals of the story of Odysseus and his family and his marriage that have made it infinitely adaptable. It's also got a much broader sort of class spectrum. It's much more demotic. The Ithaca that Odysseus lives in is a much more humble abode, and Odysseus has been, there have been Odyssey novels or novels based on the Odyssey that have made him a very lowly peasant since the early 19th century. The Iliad is much more difficult to take the grandeur out of, bring down to a more domestic or working class level. So there was one other time previously when I know that there was a very great deal of what you call popular culture emanating from adapting the Iliad, and that period was very precisely between the 1690s and about 1745. And this was, of course, the period when the two great British poets, John Dryden and Alexander Pope, produced smash hit bestseller English translations in beautiful poetry of first the Aeneid and then the Iliad and the Odyssey, which brought Homer and Virgil, but mainly Homer, to a far, far wider readership that had never penetrated to before. The reprintings of those books all the way through the 18th and 19th centuries, the way they went down to the inexpensive second-hand book market, these brought Homer to the masses. And in the actual period of the first half of the 18th century, there was a glut, actually in London, of shows based on the Troy story. Spitalfields Market, had a booth where you could go and see actors acting out bits of the fall of Troy. Southwark Fair is a famous engraving, which has the picture of Southwark Fair with a theatrical performance with trumpets of the fall of Troy, even puppet shows. So this has happened before, but since about 1745, the Iliad has been in massive retreat from popular culture. Okay, so what I've noticed happening over the last 2 decades has really knocked me for 6. And what I'm going to try to do today is show how, firstly, the Iliad has manifested itself in both very, very serious and elevated culture, mainly in the English-speaking world, because we are the English-speaking world. Also, some of its more demotic manifestations. In attempt to answer the second question, which isn't the how, it's the why. Why now? Why since the millennium? And the reasons I sort of predicted on a postcard to myself in about 2002, just after 9/11, are not the reasons I believe anymore. So now you've heard the lecture, you can all go to the pub. So this is the two most seen Achilleses of the 21st century, and probably of all time, because of the sheer penetration of Hollywood cinema and small screen serializations. We have the movie Troy, and we have Troy Fall of the City, the miniseries that played last year. So those are two of the reasons why when you say Troy to people now, they tend to know what it means. So let's look first at the popular culture. We're going to go from the ridiculous to the sublime today, okay? So first of all, we have Troy. Now, Troy had a massive penetration. I do not know how I would find out the sheer numbers of people who've watched it over the planet. I can see someone in the audience, Tony Keane, who might be able to tell us why you actually know about these things. But Troy was written by David Benioff, who learned so much about epic war that he wrote Game of Thrones. Directed by Wolfgang Peterson. It did have some excellent points. Brian Cox as Agamemnon was absolutely unforgettable. He will forever be my Agamemnon. He got the combination of Spartan crudity with narcissism, with sheer brute heft. That the Agamemnon, King of Kings, there's this wonderful, wonderful word in the Iliad for Agamemnon, which is Basileutatos. Basileus means king. All you do is add, you turn it from into the superlative, not even the comparative, but the superlative, kingiest. So he goes around saying, I'm kingiest here. Now, I'm kingier than you, but I'm also kingiest of the lot. And Brian Cox is it's worth watching the movie for that alone. The great problem for me is the women. And let us go back to this later. I just want to signal that I have never recovered from discovering that David Benioff had simply deleted Hecuba. Hecuba has stood, as everybody who knows Hamlet, and also for the tragedy of Troy and multiple bereavements for centuries. Peter O'Toole is all very well as Priam, but we so wanted Vanessa Redgrave or Meryl Streep or Helen Mirren up there beside him. She has the greatest, unbelievable role in the Iliad, two of the greatest speeches in the whole Iliad, especially her plea from the walls of Troy for Hector to come back in. Magnificent role for a woman, but of course she was post-menopause. David Benioff wasn't having any, okay? He then rolled the three really interesting young women, the interesting ones. I mean, Andromache's all very well, but the interesting one, Briseis, that's Achilles' what they used to call spear bride, and since Pat Barker we now call rape camp victim. Chryseis, who is the one that has been seized by Agamemnon, daughter of a priest of Apollo, and Kassandra. They put them all into one person, so instead of having three interesting, feisty young women, we only have one. So I nearly walked out, but I carried on. It's my duty. I'm a professor of Greek and I need to have an opinion. But that got me, right? And I actually see, by the end of this lecture, you'll see that I think an awful lot of the ways that the Iliad has been received since then are a direct response to that from men and women, but particularly women. It's the film that launched 1,000 feminisms. I want one of these for Christmas. But this is, if you put Iliad on Amazon, actually these come up very soon after, the Penguin translation. Very stylish T-shirts, all of which say either Homer, Troy, or Iliad, Troy, Greece, Troy. Even quote from it, Pope, whatever. So I do want one for Christmas. This is just an indication that there have been Odyssey artifacts that you could buy on Amazon forever, right? The Iliad has joined them. There was a board game in 1979, but which I had never ever heard. I don't know why, but a board game. You could play a board game based on the Iliad. But what is going to happen next year, coming 2020, is Total War Saga Troy. I know a bit about this one as a computer game because I was actually asked to be a consultant on it. I won't go on once I found out what was going on happening to postmenopausal women. I said, no, thank you very much. But this is apparently going to have every teenager on the planet pretending to be a hoplite at Troy and shoot 'em outs, but with spears. So that is going to make things penetrate even more. In 2006, very soon after the movie, a card game, which is actually quite interesting because they've got those random cards of things like fate. Or Apollo suddenly comes down and diverts the arrow, things like that. And actually, I recommend this for fun at Christmas. If you want to play card games with your family at Christmas, I'm going to this year. But to show you just how much things have penetrated, Martin, our wonderful, it's Martin, isn't it? Our wonderful tech man is going to play you this advert, which nobody could have ever made before the movie Troy. It's not clever. Does it come on after this?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, guys. It's not bad, is it, though? Oh, are we sure it comes on after this? I'm sorry, guys.
Is that right? No.
I don't believe so. It's nice, though.
Yeah.
We're going to try again.
I think that's enough.
This is an Amstel advert, which is in the spirit, 2006, so people had seen Troy. It's in the spirit of those time for a sharp exit.
That was you too. Sorry about that.
So can I play it now?
Would you press the button? Okay.
I know you keep saying press button, but you're not always clear which one.
This one.
Thank you.
What is it? It's a big horse. No. You know what we should do, lads? We should bring it inside. This is gonna be great. This is gonna be great. You know what we should do? Bring it inside. Nobody knows. What are those warriors with?
Now, I was worried at first about the Irish accents, because I thought we were playing to a all Irish are stupid stereotype, but in fact it's not. They turn out to be incredibly sensible, that they would rather drink lager than fight a war and couldn't care less about Helen anyway. So, but what I'm trying to argue is the extent of the penetration. Oh dear. Is that stopping now? Hope so. This Marvel comic is tremendous. It's absolutely wonderful. And if you have either an older child or a teen, or you yourself like graphic novels, which I actually quite do, it's a very, very good one. The pictures are very, very beautiful. The speech bubbles derived from the Homer are very good. I'm not putting this up, actually, as a ridiculous joke at all. It's a good present for an 8 or 10-year-old, I think, who you'd like to introduce to the ancient Greeks. The Troy Fall of the City I did find painfully disappointing. I wanted to like it, partly because of its highly controversial race-blind casting. I wanted to like it because of that. But I found the gods utterly ridiculous. It is notoriously difficult to actually to perform gods. It's an interesting question, what we do with the gods. Julie Christie as Thetis in the movie Troy didn't really get away with it. I just found it boring, and the trouble was it was on against, at the same time, as Casualty. And I've been sort of addicted to Casualty all my life, really. You know, you say you have Strictly, then you have Casualty. Was I going to bother with Troy Fall of a City? People said it was Tim Whitmarsh, who was a wonderful professor of Greek at Cambridge and a great friend of mine, and Robbins, tried hard to defend it. He did. He wrote stuff defending it. I just thought it did something unforgivable, which was make Homer boring. Boring. This is another example of splendid popular culture. This was just last month on his presidential forecast, which is hilarious. Stephen Colbert opened one of the ones in October with the impeachment discussion with this line, and this shows that people just can get the joke, right? Penetration into popular culture. In the end, Trump may be celebrated by his greatest weakness, his Achilles' mouth, Colbert quipped. It's all detailed in the epic poem, The Iliad. And they deliberately put Trump's face in a book that looks very like some sort of Penguin classic or something. But that is on very, very widely watched American popular television. People can get the joke, they know the word Iliad, which most of them, I don't think, did, amongst the uneducated anyway, until the movie. So precedents. What we've had since then, since the early 2000s, since the Troy movie, is, as we're going to see, a very large number of much more serious and culturally elevated and profound responses to the poem as well, which have tended to take a very different line, which is not celebratory of violence. It's fundamentally about the waste of warfare and the tragedy of warfare. If you like, they're counter Homeric Iliads. There are critics, including, very sad to say, we've just lost Jasper Griffin, who was Fellow of Balliol and wrote a wonderful book on the Iliad, which he argued it was actually profoundly tragic. And we were guided all the time to see every death as heartrending. I'm afraid I don't believe that. All the men who are listening to the Iliad in the 8th and 7th and 6th and the 5th centuries BC, they were all trained for combat. They all go out on the battlefield the whole time. And I actually think when Achilles is knocking his 18th Trojan into the river, people listening often were going, "Go! Go!" because they were Greek, and these were Trojans. These were people in the East. They'll have had reverberations with the Persian Wars and so on. I'm not sure that the tragic Iliad that emerged literally in World War I, that's exactly when we get our first really dark responses to the Iliad. I'm not sure it is actually wholly authentic or true to the spirit of the whole Iliad. Of course, it does do the tragedy, especially of the women and the death of Hector. But that doesn't matter. I don't believe in that sort of authenticity. I believe in the continuing life of great literature that is constantly finding new meanings and new reverberations. So this poem has become very famous, even though I have to say it's not a terribly good poem, because it's in sort of 19th century archaic speak, but it is, because of who wrote it and when, incredibly moving, because Patrick Shaw Stewart died shortly after he wrote this poem, when he was actually stationed just at the Chersonese, at the Dardanelles. And he wrote this poem, and it was found later. Achilles came to Troyland, and I to Chersonese. He turned from wrath to battle, and I from 3 days' peace. Was it so hard, Achilles, so very hard to die? Thou knewest, and I know not. So much the happier I. I will go back this morning from Imbros, which is very important in the Iliad, over the sea, stand in the trench, Achilles, flame-capped, his helmet on fire, and shout for me. And he died very soon afterwards, and it's actually difficult to even read that out, given that information, without feeling tears welling up. It just is, and the slaughter of the trenches. And that poem became far more famous than its actual literary worth. He's not the greatest of war poets, but that he's talking directly to Achilles, I'm coming to be with you. It's very, very affecting. And in 1939, a great book was written by a French pacifist, communist, feminist philosopher called Simone Veil, called The Iliad, or the Poem of Force. And it's not even a book, it's an essay, where she basically, seeing what is coming, she's French-Jewish, 1939, she does a reading of the Iliad, which is very focused on the sheer, overwhelming male violence of the whole thing, and implies that celebrating ancient warfare in those kinds of epics has somehow been responsible for making modern Europe such a militaristic culture. And of course, we know how much the Nazis celebrated certain aspects of ancient culture, particularly the Spartans and so on. So she's actually fingering heroic epic as part of the cultural heritage that's actually damaging. It's extremely profound, and quite rightly still set to by any self-respecting academic to a student studying the Iliad, because it was an absolute breakthrough and it was by a woman. And something I'm not going to discuss today, because I cannot do the entire history of the Iliad, sadly, is how women have avoided the Iliad historically. They've actually avoided Homeric epic, but they have felt more able to write Odyssey poems, for example, in the 19th century, or paint Odyssey pictures, than they ever have the Iliad. It was very much a female-free zone until Simone Veil, with the single exception of a marvellous French woman called Anne Dacier, who translated it into very good French in the early 18th century. But it has been a female-free zone. But once Veil's book is there, that has been there, sort of irritating people, knowing that there is another way of looking at that poem. And she was heavy influence on one of my favourite authors, Caroline Heilbronn, who, she's not a classicist. She was a professor of English at Barnard Columbia in New York. But in this volume, she included many essays where she looked at different female figures in the corners of canonical texts. It was extraordinarily important to feminist literary studies. And there's a chapter in it called What Was Penelope Unweaving? And although it's about the Odyssey, not the Iliad, what she says is if we start to look at these ancient texts from the perspective of a female reader, we've got two choices. Either that all women become transvestites when they read literature, right? You become a transvestite reader because you've got to identify with Odysseus, who's the one who has all the good times and the adventures and the sex and the heroism. Or we've got to go and look at the female characters, dig them up, imagine what they were thinking, imagine their story. And she asks, what on earth was it she was weaving on that text? Her silent voice that we haven't got because she had to unweave it. Now that essay was enormously influential as well. And I think Christoval's Kassandra of 1986 was a direct, heavily a response to that. Christoval's Kassandra is a retelling of the Troy story from the point of view of the prophetess whom nobody would believe. Very profound because she is an East German intellectual in the DDR, what do we call it here? DDR, GDR, who had been a very loyal member of the Communist Party. She really believed in socialist utopia and had gradually come to see how problematic it all was and had actually started to be very badly persecuted in all kinds of ways and silenced. So she totally identified with Kassandra, who could see and tell the truth about what was coming, which of course it did, only 3 years later. Very, very extraordinary. So these three texts have been sitting there, cooking, all right, until Troy the movie. And I missed out one of my favourite poems of all. We all love W.H. Auden. His Shield of Achilles was actually 1952. And this is just the last stanza, but it's about the encounter between the goddess and Hephaestus. The goddess comes to Hephaestus to say, make arms for Achilles, after the arms have been lost and Achilles is going back into battle. And it's unbelievably powerful. The thin-lipped armourer Hephaestus hobbled away, and Thetis, Achilles' mother, the shining breaths cried out in dismay at what the god had wrought to please her son. The strong, lion-hearted, man-slaying Achilles, who would not live long. That's a real poem. I think it's the best poem in response to the Iliad of all time. I do recommend you go and read the whole thing. So, context. So we arrive in the early 2000s, Troy comes out. What do I start saying to myself? Like, this is really interesting. What's happening? Why are we suddenly making it a Hollywood blockbuster about Troy? And the context to that, I can't do much cinema history with you, is that in the 1960s, there were many, many big classical epics. Well, actually, late 50s to 60s. Spartacus, Ben-Hur, Liz Taylor as Cleopatra, several other really big, what was the one called The End of the Rome, a Roman Fall of Rome or something. There were many, this was Rome. And Hollywood was identifying American society, was working out American ideas very much through the model of Rome. There was one rather disastrous Greek movie called 300 in about 1962, but Greece didn't work. It was all Rome. So when I heard about Troy, with Brad Pitt no less, I mean, this was a huge event for us classicists in terms of getting kids interested in our subject. But of course what had happened, it seemed to me at the time, was all to do with the macro political situation. So everybody in this room will be able to remember what happened at 9/11 and the war on terror, and then, the war that's been waged in Afghanistan since 2001, the actual Iraq war, which began in 2003. And it seems to me quite extraordinary that we get Troy then in 2004, and then the other two great wars that Greeks waged against the East very soon after, because there had not been movies like this, right? There had not been movies like this. The last Alexander movie was made in the 1950s with Richard Burton in a very stupid blonde wig. So we had this sudden rash, Alexander the Great by Oliver Stone, and the war pornography, which it is, war porn, I hate it, 300, of Zack Snyder. Now, no cultural historian could fail to see that there's something going on if you get three at once. It's not just that somebody decided they're good box office, it's a zeitgeist, there's something going on. And actually there was, you can actually prove there were some meetings between top American military men and Hollywood men at that time. There actually were, about what we want to put out to the world. And 300 of all of them is by far the most obviously an allegory for the superiority of Western civilization over thinly disguised Al-Qaeda Persians. I mean, it really is. It's terrible. And it is regularly shown. I have a friend in the US Army to American soldiers the night before they're sent east. It's actually used. So that's what I thought. But in fact, that's not what happened. Those sorts of triumphalist Greeks be nasty Easterners died off. It died off. And what we got was the sheep poets. And of many, I particularly picked out two. Jo Barmer, watch that name. She's an astonishing poet and has not received the attention she should have done. And she wrote a wonderful collection of poems called Chasing Catullus. She's a classicist. She studied classics at UCL. She's exactly my age. We are friends. But she included in Chasing Catullus, which has got some extraordinary poems, all based on classical myths and classical texts. And she knows her Latin and Greek really well, and she thinks about every word. There's an extraordinarily moving poem using the Demeter and Persephone myth, because her sister had a much, much, much longed-for little girl. Jo has not, for health reasons, been able to have children herself, and her sister had a little girl. The one little girl in the whole family died of cancer. And to get over it, she wrote this version of the Demeter Persephone myth, which I think it's one of the best uses of Greek myth I have ever read, the sheer conviction in it. It's in that book, but so is Fresh Meat, a perversion of Iliad 22. And what she decided to do, she didn't identify with a woman, but was think about Hector. Because book 22 of the Iliad is the final showdown. It's a bit like a Clint Eastwood movie. You built up for 21 books for Achilles to go get his man. You kept waiting and waiting, and you finally get, and they run around chasing each other. The pace of the narrative is extraordinary. But she decided to try and imagine what went through Hector's head when he realised that he was going to die. So this is a new kind of technique of building on the subjectivity of the loser. And I'm only giving you some 60-line poem, which I thoroughly recommend. But this is Hector's voice after death. That day he, Achilles, and much of this is absolutely Homeric. That day he dazzled like the dog star on a moonless sky, rising in the dark as summer fades, too bright for bare eyes, a fever surging through my veins, the old, old delusion. Yes, we must die, but not now, not yet. As he raised his spear, I saw at once the evening star caught above the coves where I'd fished as a boy, that first shaft of light falling on the mackerel scaled and gutted in our boats, floating down the waters like a sail unfurled from a black, black ship. I watched him as he scoured my skin for that one soft spot where the flesh might best be pierced, and he found it in my neck between jugular and windpipe, drove home the point, leaving me just enough breath to beg, and still I pleaded for my life. on my knees, by all the love he'd once known, not to leave me there for the strays from the ships to scavenge. I offered him my body weighed out in bronze and gold. How dare you, he snarled back. How dare you speak to me, a barterer of love? If I had the strength, if I could find the stomach, I would slice you into pieces, feed you on myself for the hurt you've done me. And even if you brought me 10 times your body weight in bronze, paid bone for bone in gold, only dogs will have the pleasure of your flesh. As you wish, I told him, as I fell. She's wonderful. But this idea of taking the subjectivity that hasn't been heard is a theme that will go on. And Alice Oswald, rightly now the Oxford Professor of Poetry, made her name really with Memorial. She was a Magdalen College Oxford classicist and a beautiful poet. And she wrote this really substantial version, it is a version of the Iliad, where she takes every single death, every single one of these endless people who only have 2 or 3 lines of obituary. Then came, Crandemus of Thrace, and his liver was hanging out after somebody gutted him, and his mother was left crying in the Balkans. This is a sort of standard 3-line thing, and it reads like a series of extraordinary obituaries. Again, this is Simone Veil in poetry, and the very end of it, quite rightly, because the poem ends thus, ended the funeral of godlike Hector, tamer of horses, is, and Hector died like everyone else. He was in charge of the Trojans, but a spear found out the little patch of skin between his collarbone and his throat, just exactly where a man's soul sits, waiting for the mouth to open. He always knew it would happen. He was so boastful and anxious, and used to nip home, deafened by weapons, to stand in full armour in the doorway like a man rushing in, leaving his motorbike running. All women loved him. His wife was Andromache. One day he looked at her quietly. He said, "I know what will happen." And an image stared at him of himself dead, and of her in Argos weaving for some foreign woman. He blinked and went back to his work. Hector loved Andromache, but in the end he let her face slide from his mind. He came back to her sightless, strengthless, expressionless, asking only to be washed and burned, his bones wrapped in soft cloths, and returned to the ground. Won prizes. Homer wins prizes. Homer keeps winning prizes. So we get on to the last section, which is actually the longest, but this is fiction. And it is in prose fiction that the biggest glut of novels. I mean, people will be setting exam questions on this in 50 years' time in classics departments, like describe and explain the reasons for the incredible glut of Iliad novels in the the first 2 decades of the 20th century. I firmly predict that. And in fact, the first is the least talked about, but it's wonderful. It's Ardell Gareth, who is a very delicate writer of young adult fiction. And this is a perfect novel for young adults, I find, for sixth formers, because she actually took these 2 spear brides stroke rape camp victims, Chryseis and Briseis, and retold the story very much from their point of view, and she also really understood, having researched properly, just how young these women were. We are not talking even 18-year-olds, we're talking almost certainly for the sort of pick of the crop when you besieged a city, the unmarried girls or the just married girls before they'd have babies, which means 14, 15, 16. And it's good because she's quite sort of optimistic. They do both survive the Iliad, those 2. So she's chosen it very well as to be a story of hope and resilience, not just utter death and destruction. Malouf, David Malouf, Australian writer, won a lot of prizes again for his Ransom, 2009, and it is exquisite prose. But it's very much a boy's own story because it's the 24th book of the Iliad. It's the meeting, the incredible meeting of Priam and Achilles, where Priam, the old man from Troy, actually gets up the courage to go alone unarmed, in a cart into the enemy camp just to ask Achilles for the corpse of Hector back. And it was very, it is an extraordinary moment where the enemies on both sides realise briefly that the war was for nothing, that they have more in common. Priam has no sons left. Achilles has always been looking for a father figure. And they have physical contact and they smile at each other, and it is astonishingly moving. And David Malouf wrote a very good novel about it, and I have nothing whatsoever against that. Don't let me say that I have. But it was very much from the perspective of combatants and male conflict. And since then, we've had this run, really, just the last 3 years. Let me get the date right. Actually, I think the first one was Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles, which, of course, burst onto the scene and won the Orange Prize for Fiction when nobody's ever heard of her. There are a lot of very, very famous women novelists who were very cross because who is this classicist? She teaches classics in school, or did, in the United States. It's a very lyrical love story. The bit I like best is the centaur. Chiron brought Achilles up, and we have a speaking centaur, which I think is very, very magical. She likes to leave in the supernatural and divine elements. It's one of the distinctive things about her style. But it is a gay love story. She says, come on, Achilles and Patroclus, give us a break, and makes it a stunning tragedy because Achilles loses his lover. And it's highly progressive and highly well-meaning, and it's also, I must say, her ear for the ancient Greek epithets and how to make them into beautiful English prose is exquisite, exquisite. She's also written an Odyssey novel now, Circe, which I like less, but is going to be televised on. Somebody bought it, some big studios bought it. It's going to be televised. But the Song of Achilles, again, very much from the male point of view, and actually in the Iliad, the poets of the Iliad went out of their way to insist there was no sex between Achilles and Patroclus. In Book 9, when Achilles is sulking in his tent with his myrmidons and he's playing his guitar, he plays the kithara and sings, going to go out on the battlefield, and we're told very clearly that Achilles went to sleep on one side of the tent with his girl, and Patroclus was all the way over on the other side. And the poetry actually goes out of its way. And in a way, that's always made it far... In a way, it's more profound, because his relationship with Patroclus transcended all of that. It was a deep bond from boyhood. Deep, deep, deep bond. And actually, people don't realise this, but Patroclus, we're told he's older. He was like an older brother to a boy with father problems. He's this older, passionately beloved older brother figure. And I find that grief for that, in terms of sort of intense friendship, actually more masterful. I'm glad she did it, and that's fine, and there are plenty of versions in antiquity where they are lovers, but it's not in Homer. And the fact that it's not in Homer makes it a better poem, I believe, about real, profound love that goes beyond the body. But this, I can't remember, and I should have put it up, what year she won the Orange Prize for Fiction. It's about 2013. Could anybody know? Anybody remember? So, was it on there? Oh, okay. That made a very great number of novelists start running around doing Homer novels. Emily Hauser, who's lovely, she's a lecturer at Exeter University, wrote another Briseis and Briseis novel in 2016. Very different and very interesting read. It's not youth fiction, it's more adult. And Michael Hughes this year won the London Hellenic Prize, which is the prize for the best book in relation to ancient Greek studies or ancient Greece. It's handed out annually. I'm just going to carp here. I have now been runner-up apparently 5 times. Runner-up. It's 10,000 quid. 10,000 quid, I could both do a lot for my Widening Up participation project and do my kitchen. But never mind. Michael Hughes, it's a terrific novel. He's a brilliant Irish actor and writer. And he decided to set the Iliad during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And he did something intensely brave. Because he's Catholic. And he made Hector the British army guy invading Ireland, not the other way around. The invader is, of course, Achilles, it's the Greeks. He did. I interviewed him at Waterstones or something about it, and he just said he did not want to go down. He thinks Hector is magnificent. He thinks that a lot of the British Army, I'm not saying what I think, that a lot of the things that the British Army did were very good, okay, and that he wanted to write a novel that didn't just do the predictable Republican thing about nasty British imperialists. But what it is, it needs to be on the radio, this. His ear for different Ulster dialects is unbelievable, and it needs to be read aloud. I got why people think it's so good as soon as I started reading it out loud, and he performs it brilliantly. If you get a chance to hear him reading it, I have to say the women are a huge disappointment. I mean, they just don't fit. It does not pass the Bechdel test. It really doesn't. And Helen is a very silly girl. It fails on feminist grounds completely, but it's an interesting version. Then we come, of course, to the big one, which is the amazing Pat Barker's Silence of the Girls, with which I think she shared the Booker Prize. Is that right? Yeah, she did. But anyway, this is the most, we all know Pat Barker from her trilogy of novels set in World War I about working class life in the north of England and the strong women and the terrible trenches and all the rest of it. And she's taken that gritty northern realism to what life was like for Briseis. Briseis is her speaker. And it's really grueling read, to be honest, because these women are routinely raped, routinely beaten up, trying to give birth to babies in mud that is completely infected and infested with vermin. It's set in the rape camp of Troy, where all the women from northern Anatolia were rounded up. What it brought out more clearly to me than anything, quite fascinating, she's based it on a speech which is only 18 lines in book 19, and this is Briseis. And it's rightly celebrated and famous and incredibly intriguing. So, you have to concentrate just for a minute. So, Briseis was Achilles' girl. Agamemnon then decided he was going to have her when he had to give up Chryseis. So she's probably being, and in the novel, brutally raped by both Achilles and Agamemnon, right? She then goes back to Achilles when Agamemnon and he do their truce. But the one she loves is Patroclus, and that is made quite clear by Homer, because when Patroclus' corpse is brought in, this is Achilles' friend, she has this lament over his corpse of the utmost intensity, where she says, "I always loved you because you were kind to me." And Patroclus' epithet in the Iliad is often the kind one. So this kindness, it's like so rare in the Iliad. You were just kind to me. I may have been just the, shaggy, but you treated me with respect. And you said you would make sure I would marry Achilles when we got back to Greece. So although she loved him, and obviously would have liked to marry him, I think, herself, that's crucial, because if you read histories of women in these war situations where rape is used as a weapon, is the importance of getting, you can't get out of it, but the importance of getting the top-ranking officer you can to choose you. Because that will protect you from being raped by everybody else. And I read an amazing book called Woman in Berlin about just after the fall of Berlin and the routine rape of Berlin women by Soviet soldiers, which is exactly about that she found that one thing to do, she got the top officer she could, went made a beeline for him and became his mistress. And I think that's what Briseis is sort of getting at, right? You made sure Achilles wanted me, so the other guys, no guy was going to try and rape Briseis with Achilles around, right? It's extraordinary little thing, which would actually have been sung as a lament at the funeral. And Pat Barker, with her extraordinary eye, picked this up and tells us the whole war, pretty much, from Briseis's point of view. And she survives it. Again, there is some resilience. They do occasionally sound as though they're talking like Edwardian Geordies. But hey, I can cope with that. I am full of admiration for this book. The Silence of the Girls actually comes inspired by a line from Sophocles' Ajax. And Ajax is a big character in it. They're very, very fleshed out, because Tecmessa, his spear bride, is in it. And in Sophocles' Ajax, at one point, Ajax tells his wife to shut up. And then silence becomes a woman. One of these proverbs. And of course, in this, she's giving the women a speech back. But don't read it, if you want to go to sleep for the night, because it's heavily violent. And finally, some fiction is getting into performance. In 2015, the Almeida Theatre put on its now celebrated production of the entire Iliad, with very famous actors like John Sim performing it sequentially. Because the Iliad itself does not pass the Bechdel test, and they had women doing the women's parts, for the most part, and men doing the men's parts. It didn't advance it in any way from that point of view. I didn't actually go, I'm ashamed to say. I couldn't. I don't know why. I was out of the country, but I have heard that it was very gruelling, but absolutely riveting to have such expert actors delivering the Iliad. And then was followed suit at the Edinburgh Lyceum with a different but similar performance, male-dominated, you can see from the helmets, in Edinburgh the year after. And I'm now going to get very personal, because two of my very closest friends, and it's only coincidence they're my friends, because these are monumental performances, have over the last 18 months absolutely finally claimed the Iliad for women in every conceivable way. First is Lynn Cohen, extraordinary. I taught her briefly when I had a visiting chair at Chicago. She's Canadian, she's North American. She's now at McGill in Montreal, and as the head of the department there, a professor of Greek, and has written an excellent book. She's in love with Hector. She's been in love with Hector all her life. And over 6 months, as she got more and more pregnant with her first child, literally, she, every Monday night in Montreal downtown bar, did her show previously on the Iliad, where she delivered, it was partly paraphrase and partly big whole speeches. She performed over 26, the whole, well, it would have been 24, but it was over half the year, the last second 2 trimesters of her pregnancy, the whole Iliad. It's all on YouTube. It is gobsmacking. It is gobsmacking. And when we finally get to the book 24 and Hector's on his beer, her pregnant bum, it's like this, but actually that made it, because of the scene with Andromache and Astyanax and knowing the baby will die, having this heavily pregnant woman, she's actually very androgynous looking normally, but by the end, that's how she was 9 months pregnant, nobody looks androgynous. And because she's such a secret, and it became a kind of local cause célèbre, it was sold out, people were queuing down the road, and it was a happy hour. You went for your cocktail and your Iliad. Fantastic. And then just 10 days ago, I've reached the climax, you'll be pleased to hear. These women finally got their say in a theatre performance of Homer. And that is actually just the sheer number of female fatalities. We hear all the time about the lament scenes and the loss and the bereavement, and Andromache loses everybody and Hecuba loses everybody. But actually, Polyxena, in the Troy story, Iphigenia, both sacrificed to try and by heavy metal warriors. Creusa, Aeneas' wife, is basically burnt to death as Troy falls. And Kassandra is not only raped, both by, in some versions, the lesser Ajax, she's hiding from him, trying to clutch onto the statue of Athena there in Troy, and that's the lesser Ajax, not who's going to rape her, but then of course she gets taken by Agamemnon, and then she's actually killed herself by Clytemnestra. So these 4 female fatalities had really got under the skin of another very good friend of mine, Natalie Hayes, who is, in that picture there, the lady on the right with the glasses. Natalie Hayes is, you may know from the very popular BBC Radio show, BBC Radio 4 show, Nat Hayes Stands Up for the Classics, where she does, she's another Cambridge classicist, but she's recently started writing novels, and her 1,000 Ships has rather slipped under Pat Barker's radar. I mean, people are reading it, but because Pat Barker had done The Silence of the Girls, and this book just came out in May, The 1,000 Ships, This is the Woman's War, has not yet, I feel, because it's just as good, it's just very different. And she writes monologues from the point of view of, I think it's 30 of the women involved in the Troy story, most of them from the Iliad, but she adds things like, it's framed by actually the muse Calliope herself, saying, Homer, you know, could you please make more of an effort with the Bechdel test? You know, it's very, very witty and tragic by turns. And I'm absolutely thrilled to say I was there, that on the 17th of November 2019, the beautiful nationally restored National Theatre of Cyprus, there is that, a week ago on Sunday, I was there. They, another former PhD student of mine, Magdalena, the lady on Zira, Dr. Zira, who is one of Cyprus's top directors, spent October translating this thing into modern Greek and she got a lot of money and a lot of very famous actresses and all female technical team, which has never happened, ever. Certainly in Cyprus, I believe in Greece before, all the technicians were female, all the performers were female, and they told the story. It took us 10 hours from 11 in the morning till 9 at night of all the women. It was like being in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I mean, it was exhausting that they all came, said, this is what happened to me. It was extraordinarily exciting for me because we've been through these different stages of poets who start to look at it from the subjectivity of one person or call into question the militaristic values, or Pat Barker's novel, telling it from the point of view of Briseis. But here it's only staged reading at the moment, and even that was unbelievable, it was very well lit. Fortunately, I speak modern Greek, so I could get it. Nat doesn't, and she sat there with her own book, going all the way through it, tears streaming down her face. And the absolute standout in it was an actress who may be coming over to Britain with it, Nevi Constantine, who played Muse and some other parts. And she is herself a middle-aged mother and a superb actress. She's also bilingual. She lived for many years in California, so she's good. And we're probably going to get it into the British Museum with her doing just some of it before the end of the Troy exhibition. So watch out for that. But I love that because what she actually sent me, we've both gone back, and I went off to Cambridge after the EasyJet that gets in at midnight, and she went off to London, was the picture she found on the building next door to the theatre. Smash patriarchy, riot like a girl. But I did not know when I agreed to this lecture that this was going to happen. It just feels unbelievably timely that I'm here to be able to tell you about it. And something more will happen. There will be a fully staged production of The 1,000 Ships with its all-female cast, its all-female subjectivity. And I think it's about time. So that's it. Thank you very much.